Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to talk to Dr. Faris Abdel-hadi. You are most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, and thank you so much for having me here.
It's great to have you on the show. Now, Dr. Faris is an independent researcher, writer, and publisher with a background in commercial law. He delivers lectures, seminars, and workshops around the world on the subject of Sufism, Islamic philosophy, and intellectual history. His latest book, which is this one here, Ibn Arabi's Religious Pluralism, Levels of Inclusivity, published by Routledge this year, 2025, marks a significant contribution to the debate concerning Ibn Arabi's views on religion, focusing on his multifaceted approach to non-Abrahamic traditions. So Dr. Faris is very kindly going to introduce the wider subject of Ibn Arabi's thought and then focus on into his book later on. So I'll just upload the first slide. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul. And again, thank you for the extraordinary work you've been doing as well, mashallah. So basically, this book was published a few months ago, but I think the majority of people would at least have come across the name of this Sufi Andalusian quasi-philosopher, whose name is, of course, Muhammad ibn al-Arabi al-Hatimi al-Ta'i, otherwise better known as just simply as Ibn al-Arabi. Most people would have heard his name at least once or twice in their lifetime. But these days, you tend to come across his name with a view towards the controversies that are associated with that name. So I'd like to address that first, if that's all right. And, I think it's such an interesting question and issue because Ibn al-Arabi is not a small figure, not by any stretch of the imagination, particularly when we look at the, his, the effects his writings have had over history since his posthumous since his death for the past 850 years. What influence has he had over the whole Islamic world? So the reason that people get involved with this issue as to, the controversies associated with Ibn al-Arabi is because what he has to say has an impact on who we identify as. In particular, if you are a Sunni Muslim, it is an issue of such pertinence that it arouses passions, simply because Ibn al-Arabi is a figure that one cannot ignore. And there's also a recognized sense of authority that lies with Ibn al-Arabi, whether one agrees with him or not. So he is not inconsequential. And it's also related to what he has to say about what I think is a significant portion of the Islamic tradition, which is to do with wilaya, or what could be translated as friendship with God, or what is sometimes translated as sainthood and ma'rifah, which is gnosis, or this kind of having direct knowledge of God or Allah. So I think it's important to contextualize Ibn al-Arabi in his environment before we begin to address the issue of these controversies that tend to be associated with his name. Now, he occupies a relatively unique position in contemporary scholarship and academia. And I think that this is because hundreds of his books are available to us. One of his books, the magnum opus, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, spans thousands upon thousands of pages. We still have that. We have a large corpus of his writings, so we have reasonable access to what he thought, to what he taught, and what he said. And even more exceptionally, we have access to his autobiographical data, which connects to the way he not only has lived his life, but applied those teachings to his life. And that gives us an insight into the way he thought. In fact, he has written so much about himself. You could, without exaggeration, establish a TV series on him. And for someone who was born 850 years ago, that is really quite unique.
So, just to clarify, where he was born, was he not Spanish? Actually, is it a European Muslim, really, in the indigenous sense?
He was born in Murcia, actually, in the year 1165 of the Gregorian calendar, or 560 of the Hijri year. And he was born in Murcia, and he spends the beginning of his life in Spain, traveling throughout Granada and Cordoba, amongst other Spanish towns and localities. And then he ventures into the wider Islamic world as he grows older. And he is a perennial traveler, traveling throughout the entire Islamic world. So he is, despite, I guess, some of the criticisms, and sometimes despite even some of the vitriolic attacks that are leveled against Ibn al-Arabi, one does have to recognize that he is first and foremost an alim, a scholar. And he is a Sufi as well, who is trained in the methods of Western Andalusian Sufism, as well as the Eastern school as well. And he is arguably a Sunni. This view may not necessarily be accepted by all scholars, but I think, to be fair to him, it is reasonable to identify him with what he considers himself to be, which is a Sunni. If you consider the fact that he has this massive respect and devotion towards the Sahaba and towards their views and their opinions, that would qualify him to at least to be a prima facie Sufi, notwithstanding the other, I suppose, issues that come along with determining whether one is Sunni or not. And being a scholar, it's a given that he was very knowledgeable of the four major legal schools, in addition to Ibn Hazm's own school, which is the Dahiri school, founded by Dawood al-Dahiri. So Ibn Arabi himself, despite being knowledgeable of the four legal schools, does not, strictly speaking, adhere to any one particular legal school. He is, in fact, what some scholars would consider to be a mujtahid mutlaq. There is another opinion that he's actually a Dahiri I guess, he is a Dahiri in disguise, let's say, in disguise. My own view is that he is a mujtahid mutlaq. He has the ability to found his own legal school, given his significant training and knowledge in fiqh and usul fiqh, the foundations of jurisprudence and jurisprudence itself. And so, therefore, by extension, he is well trained in virtually all the sciences and subjects and disciplines of his day. He is a massive hadith expert. He has studied with major muhaddithun of his day and age, around 60 teachers. So he took the study of hadith incredibly seriously. And then his foremost student and stepson, his stepson, so he ends up, Ibn al-Arabi ends up marrying the mother of Salahuddin al-Qunawi, who goes on to become his foremost student, was also a surpassing hadith master of his own time. And so in that vein, Ibn al-Arabi composes one of the earliest collections of what is called Hadith Qudsi, Hadith Qudsi, which I guess you could translate as holy or divine hadith, in which God speaks in the first person, and is, of course, not Quran, it's hadith. According to the Syrian alim, Dr. Samir al-Nas, he says this is the earliest. Ibn al-Arabi's collection is the earliest one that he's aware of, right? So, of course, Hadith Qudsi existed before Ibn al-Arabi, but to gather it into a collection as a particular genre in itself, he is one of the first ones to do that. And so, therefore, he obviously knew the major collections of hadith, the six mother collections, if you like, in addition to Malik's Muwatta. And he knew the Sunan of Bayhaqi and Tabarani very well, and he quotes those hadith extensively in his writings. So now we're going to go back to his autobiography. What is the impetus for his pursuit for hadith? Well, in the beginning stage of his life, before he begins the spiritual path of converting himself to the path of God and becoming devoted totally to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and becoming what is known as a salik, a spiritual traveler, he has this vision, triplitic vision of Jesus, Moses, and Muhammad, who are instrumental in converting him to the way of God. So into becoming a proper Sufi, if you like. So this vision of Muhammad, in this vision he says, in my sleep, I saw myself in a huge space, surrounded by armed people who intended to kill me. There was nowhere at all I could find refuge. Then I saw in front of me a hill on which the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, was standing. Immediately I took refuge beside him. He opened his arms wide and pressed me very forcefully against himself, saying, my beloved, hold fast to me and you will be safe. I then looked around me to see my assailants, but there was no longer a single one of them to be seen. So from that time onwards, that was when I gave myself to the study of prophetic narrations. And then there's another dream he has, which basically lauds the lofty status of a hadith, in which someone says, I saw in my sleep a man from amongst the pious shortly after his death. And I asked him, what have you seen? And he told me the certain things and said to me in particular, I saw books that were abased and books that were elevated. So what were the elevated books? The books of hadith. And what were the abased books? The books of ra'i, the books of one's own personal opinion. And their authors will be held accountable for it in the hereafter. So again, he took the study of hadith very seriously. He was learned in the 7 recitations, qira'at, of the Quran. And he was very familiar with the tafsir tradition as a whole. And the seerah was transmitted to him by the scholars of his day, for example, Abdurrahman Suhaili. And so he transmitted to him his commentary on Ibn Hisham's seerah. And then he's, of course, well-versed in poetry and the major collections of poetry, whether it be Al-Mutanabbi or Abu Nawas, and the pre-Islamic poets, the Jahili poets as well. And he used to frequent the company of judges, jurists, doctors, philologists, grammarians, poets, historians, and other people as well. And he traveled around the world with the famous explorer Ibn Jubayr. And he met Ibn Rushd, of course, the famous Aristotelian Averroes, at least once in his life, according to his own testimony. And he was familiar with the issues of kalam and philosophy, referencing Imam al-Haramain, and of course, Isfara'ini, and of course, Imam Ghazali, without a doubt. And he has personally, according to his own testimony, and we have this letter, he personally corresponded with Fakhr ad-Din Razi, albeit not to discuss the finer issues of kalam and philosophy, although perhaps to proselytize Razi and ask him to become a itinerant Sufi and to give up this path of overthinking things and just to go into spiritual retreats in order to understand what reality is. So he has corresponded with Fakhr ad-Din Razi. And of course, it goes without saying that he was familiar with classical Sufism, the Sufism of Junayd al-Baghdadi, of course. And by extension, he would dedicate his entire life to the pursuit of the path of friendship with God or sainthood. Friendship is technically more accurate, but I prefer the word sainthood, but friendship is more accurate. I find it fascinating that this dimension of Islam is perhaps less taught in certain countries, because it tends to be quite an integral part of the religion, and it's been integral. It has been this integral part of the religion at least for the past 1,000 years. So it's just interesting to see that maybe less emphasized in certain places. And then Ibn Arabi, of course, himself exists in that same line of training, being trained to be a saint. And so he's familiar with the whole tradition of classical Sufism and Walaya. And then it goes without saying that his own saintly teachers were well acquainted with the Islamic sciences. And then in contrast to those teachers whom he loved dearly, and who were like these kind of like rugged figures who lived in the wilderness without light or fire, barely eating any scraps of food, and living life in the most humble circumstances. He, again, rubbed shoulders with everyone, whether they were urban or used to live in the countryside, like these Sufis. And these Sufis performed miracles and charismatic feats. There's no shortage of them. And they possess extraordinary character traits. So, having said that, in Ibn Arabi's own testimony, the greatest wali, therefore friend of God, in Islam would be Abu Bakr. And so, this is what he says about Abu Bakr. Without a shadow of a doubt, Abu Bakr's faith is equal to that of the entire Ummah, and even outweighs them by the like of it. And at least for Sunni Muslims, the status of Abu Bakr is a given. And I obtained, praise be to God, this voracious Bakrian faith, you could call it Bakrian faith, Al-Iman al-Siddiqi al-Bakri, in the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, and in his inheritors, may God be pleased with them. Although I do not profess that they are divinely protected from sins, all right? So this is a Sunni doctrine, except what they report from God. So he is putting forward a very interesting view in which, although he does not believe that the Sahaba are sinless, but they cannot make an error with regard to what they report from God, and that includes the inheritors of the Messenger of God, who are the awliya, for Ibn al-Arabi, who are the friends of God. And so, what is the impact of this Akbarian legacy? After the death of Ibn al-Arabi, it spreads quickly and globally, and it clearly influences a school of Irfan, of mystical knowledge in Iran, and philosophy. And it has this massive impact on the whole of the Mughal Empire, right? And promotes a relative ecumenism, what is called Sulh al-Kul. That's kind of like universal tolerance, which you should take with a grain of salt, because there is a incentive for empire to promote that kind of ecumenism in order for empire to function, if you take that with a grain of salt. But his writings in the Mughal Empire are super influential. Whether one disagrees with them or not, they influence this interreligious discourse that carries out throughout the centuries. And of course, it is well known that he is a major, if you use this figure of speech, patron saint of the Ottoman Empire, in which Dawood al-Qaysari is the first head of the Ottoman educational system, and Mullah Fanari, these are his indirect students, becomes the first Sheikh al-Islam in the Ottoman Empire. And his teachings are protected under the patronage of the Rasul dynasty for 200 years in Yemen, at least 200 years. And so you get these Yemeni Akbarian Sufis. If I say Akbarian, that means they come from Ibn al-Arabi's school. These Sufis are under the protection of this dynasty. And it reaches the Malay-Indonesian archipelago as early as the 15th, 16th centuries. And then it spreads into China through the writings of Abdurrahman Jami, in which a specific group who are called the Han Kitab managed to synthesize an extraordinary application of the faith between Confucianism and Islam, using the writings of Abdurrahman Jami and Akbarian thought. And then, of course, Salahuddin Qunawi, Ibn al-Arabi's foremost student himself, corresponds also with Nasiruddin Tusi, the foremost scientist philosopher of his day. Abdullah Nabulsi is a major public voice who gets involved in social issues. One of them is to do with, in that day and age, there is this introduction to tobacco and coffee, for example, should those be allowed or not, right? And then the Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who is a major, I guess, figure in this school, and is a major devotee to Ibn al-Arabi's teachings, and is also very well known for having, of course, resisted French colonization in Algeria. He, in Damascus, his The story of his life is fascinating, by the way. But he single-handedly saved around 11 to 15,000 Christians in a local uprising that are instigated by the Ottoman authorities at that time. And so he is gifted a pistol from Abraham Lincoln and granted audience with the Queen of England. And to this day, a town in Iowa is named after him. It's called Al-Qadr. The high school there is called Al-Qadr High School, in which they honor the Emir Abdul Jazairi and annually, which is extraordinary. So Ibn Arabi has written at least 350 to 400 books, which is a staggering output. And then there are 800 books in total attributed to his name, but you could say half of those aren't his books, and about half of those are books he has actually written. Nonetheless, if we're going to get into the controversies of Ibn al-Arabi, it would seem that the source, almost in its entirety, for major criticisms against Ibn al-Arabi lies solely with a book called Fusus al-Hikam, which I'm sure you would have heard of at some point. This book is not a particularly big book. It's about 200 pages, really. And that's what makes it so open to attack.
Well, so what does this book mean in English? That's obviously an Arabic title. How would you translate the title?
So if you take Austin's translation, that would be the bezels of wisdom. The bezels of wisdom. Or you could even call it the ringstones of wisdom.
Okay.
And that requires an explanation in itself. To be fair, there is, I guess, what you might call anonymous opinions. No, not anonymous, but singular opinions that the book is not written by Ibn Arabi. In fact, it is a forgery, but it's generally rebutted in the academia and by traditional scholars themselves. So you've got, for example, Chalkevich and Sheikh Abdul-Baqi Miftah. They refute that claim that the Fusus is forged. And there is a general acceptance that the book we have today, the Fusus al-Hikam, pretty much in its entirety, was written by Ibn al-Arabi.
And it's available in English, I assume. It's been translated?
It's been translated. There are at least 4 English translations, and there are also translations in other languages as well. Right. So you've got the translation by Ralph Austin, and then Kenneth Dagley. And then there's a more recent one by Benyamin Abrahamov, and there's also another one by Aisha Bewley. So
Aisha Bewley, okay.
And so she's translated,
yeah. Okay.
And she's translated parts of the Futuhat as well. So there is one opinion that is a forgery, and we can see why. And Mahmoud Ghurab is a defender of Ibn al-Arabi. And there are other defenders who would incline to the view that this book is a forgery, and one can sort of understand why, right? Because pretty much the controversial issues surrounding Ibn Arabi come from this book. That includes this concept of he is most famous for, that is attributed to him, which is called Wahdat al-Wujud, which you can translate as the unity of being or the unity of existence. Now, to be fair to Ibn al-Arabi, he doesn't use this word himself, but it becomes associated with him in the polemical attacks against him, particularly by Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, and the scholars that follow after him. Another controversial issue is the people who remain in the fire will obtain bliss or will attain to bliss and some kind of salvation in the fire, what you might call, what's the word? This, in the Christian tradition, this apokatastasis. And then there's the issue of Pharaoh, who, according to Ibn al-Arabi, died upon faith and believing in God and is therefore saved just before he drowns. And then the final issue is...
Sorry, doesn't the Quran say that he died an unbeliever, a disbeliever?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, and we'll get into that when we get into the slides. No, but that's
I'm reading the Quran in that section at the moment, and I seem to recall it said that he died a disbeliever. But anyway, I don't want to disturb you on.
No, not at all. Just out of interest, do you have the surah chapter on hand? The surah title. Just out of interest.
I don't. No, I read it a couple of
Okay.
days ago. Actually,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay, then we'll get to that section
Okay.
eventually. And then the final issue is to do with what is called the universality of faith.
Right.
Sometimes, it's given this misnomer, wahdat al-adyan, the unity of religions, which I don't think is applicable to Ibn al-Arabi actually. But it's the idea that every religion and every person in the world believes in God in some respect, whether he knows it or not, right? So that would be the universality of faith. Every person on this planet has a degree of faith in God, whether they know it or not. And every person from every religion is worshiping God, whether he knows it or not. How is that the case? We'll come to that. Or at least, how does he argue for it, at least? So just to address this issue of forgery very quickly, it's not a strong argument, and there's a simple reason for that. Nearly every paragraph that you find in the Fusus, the bezels of wisdom, has a close or identical counterpart in terms of idea, theme, or substance in the Futuhat and other of Ibn al-Arabi's works. What is the Futuhat? The Futuhat the Fusus al-Hikam is one of his most important works. It's a magnum opus. So is the Futuhat. The Futuhat is a magnum opus as well. The Futuhat al-Makkiyah, or the openings, or what you might call the Meccan revelations. The Meccan revelations, or the openings in Mecca. The word even means conquest, like this kind of like spiritual conquest of Mecca and the whole Islamic tradition by extension. It is one of Ibn al-Arabi's most important works. This is the Futuhat that spans thousands of pages, and a autobiographical copy of what's called the second redaction has been preserved in the library of Salahuddin al-Qunawi, and it is now preserved in a museum in Turkey. I think Konya, if I'm not mistaken, but it's there in Turkey, and it can be viewed to this day. It has now been digitized, so you can view the actual manuscript leaves themselves online, right? And then there's been several editions of this Futuhat as well, and new editions continue to appear because it's not an easy book to get right, given that it spans thousands of pages. So, coming back to the subject, any idea you can find in the Fusus really, in a nutshell, already exists in the Futuhat. Right? Now, what does Ibn al-Arabi say about the law? It's nice to get a summary about his idea and adherence to the Sharia, the law, after we've already contextualized him with a scholarly background, right? So it should be no surprise if we have gone over his scholarly background and established that he's well-versed in this Islamic sciences and has adhered to the Islamic sciences. It should be no surprise to see him upholding the law, right? So what does he say? He says that the Sharia is identical with the Haqiqah. The Sharia is identical with the reality. What is called in philosophy al-amr fi nafsih. Al-amr fi nafsih, with the way things are. And also, the Sharia takes one to the Haqiqah. Why do we talk about Haqiqah? Because that's the Sufi's goal, right? And so, one cannot make the claim that my spiritual journey, and therefore my spiritual attainment, enables me to break the law. For Ibn Arabi, that is an oxymoron, and that is impermissible. The Sharia takes you to the Haqiqah, but the Haqiqah takes you back to the Sharia, because the Sharia is the way things are. And so, he says again in an autobiographical note, I saw in a vision that the doors of heaven had been opened and the storehouses of divine deception were descending like an omnipresent rain. I heard an angel saying, "What deception has descended tonight?" And I woke terrified. I considered the way to safety from that, and I could not find it except in knowledge of the scale, the mizan, the scale set by the law. So if anyone desires that God give him good and preserve him from the calamities of deception, let him never let the scale of the law drop from his hand. So at the very least, we have to admit that he is explicitly calling for adherence to the law. We have to acknowledge that much. And then he just repeats the same point, really ad infinitum. And he says, it belongs to the saints to preserve the Sharia for everyone. That is really the goal of the highest saints. But it's not, if they are not allowed to make law. Why? Because the coming of Muhammad ﷺ abrogates the previous laws. And therefore, he seals prophethood. He seals nubuwwah. What that means by extension is that no law may come after the law of Muhammad ﷺ. That's why it belongs to a saint to preserve the law and to understand the law in all its dimensions. But you can't make law because the lawgiver is Muhammad. And so he says, we have no way to God except that which he has laid down for us as law. He who says there is another way to God other than the Sharia, different from what he has laid down in the law, has spoken falsehood, right? And then he talks about the path of the Sharia, which he says is easy, bright, exemplary, pure, unstained, without any crookedness or deviation. But as for the other path, which is not غير شرعي, which is not by law, that other path, its final outcome is felicity, which we'll get into, which is bliss in the fire. But along the way are found deserts, perils, vicious predators, and harmful serpents. In other words, damnation. Hence, no created thing reaches the end of the second path without suffering those terrors, right? If one disregards the law. So in other words, Ibn Arabi is a staunch upholder of the law. So when we say that he's controversial, we therefore need to ask the question, controversial according to whom? Because Ibn Arabi is clear about his own position, about the importance of adhering to the Sharia, right? So therefore, it seems to me that the Ibn Arabi that is being attacked is almost like a dehistoricized and a decontextualized caricature, almost. And we'll come to that and see if we can look at any quotes that describe that. Now, I don't know why I've done that to my own slide, but someone gives the definition of wahdat al-wujud, and I think this is more of what we might call pamphlet literature, which is just a collection of quotes as to why Ibn Arabi is so bad. But just to give one example, what is the definition of wahdat al-wujud according to this book or pamphlet? And it essentially says that Allah and the creation are identical to one another. Allah and the creation are completely identical to one another. And that is almost what we might call the reductionist perspective on Ibn al-Arabi. It is definitely a reductionist take as to what wahdat al-wujud is, if we are going to use this term now. Ibn Arabi almost never uses this term, as we said, and certainly not in a systematic way, right? But there are other terms that come close. So what is wujud, being, for Ibn al-Arabi? And therefore, what is the unity of being? So his own explanation of wujud is incredibly sophisticated, multifaceted, and elaborated over thousands upon thousands of pages in the Futuhat. Anyone who reads the Fusus will generally have a fairly solid grasp over the Futuhat, right? Which is what enables you to understand the arguments that are being made in the Fusus al-Hikam with regard to the unity of being. What is it then? What is the unity of being? That's going to need some explanation. But in a nutshell, it is saying that being is one. There is no division in being. Being is one. And two, it belongs to God. Wujud belongs to God in the same way that every other object in existence belongs to God. He owns it. God owns wujud, but thirdly, and perhaps a bit more confusingly, God is identical to wujud, right? And we'll see how Ibn Arabi argues that. And that is distinct and different from saying God is identical to the things in wujud. He is not. He is not identical to the things in wujud. He is identical to wujud itself. All right. So if we're going to get into the argument, we need to address the presuppositions that are built into anyone's, anyone's perception as to what wahdat al-wujud is. What are the presuppositions there, right? And there's a very simple question. You need to know what wujud is, so which is being or existence. So, is being a mental construct, a construct of the mind, and it's not an actual thing? So, is it dhihni, or is it something real and lies outside of the mind, fil kharaj, right? So, for example, we can talk about an apple and a horse, right? And this is going to get into a whole lot of philosophy and the terminology and ideas of which Ibn Arabi inherits and then addresses, right? The distinction between being and essence, for example, right? Wujud versus mahiyya. Now, if you take the first view that wujud is just a mental construct, you say that the apple and the horse are real, right? But if you take, and then when I talk about existence and being, that's just a figure of speech. We might say it is a quantifier. But if you take the second view, and this is Ibn al-Arabi's view, and the view of those in his school of thought, if you take the second view is that the apple and the horse are what we might consider to be expressions of being and configurations of being. They are expressions of being, or they are what you might call entifications or configurations of being itself, right? So God is wujud according to this view. And of course, the whole discussion is rooted in kalam and philosophical ideas. Now, if you say being is real, then it functions as a sort of mahiyya, a sort of quiddity. And in philosophy, wujud and mahiyya are conceived of separately except for God. For God, his wujud is his mahiyya. And the reason that needs to be the case is because there is nothing wider or more encompassing or universal than being itself, right? When you're trying to establish what is God, then you go into the sciences of the ilahiyat or al-hikmah al-khalidiyya, which tries to establish on a first principle basis what is being, right? And so just as there is nothing wider, more encompassing than God himself, theologically speaking, in philosophy, there is nothing wider, there's no category more encompassing or wider than being itself. Thus, God is being. Now, the things in existence are a entification or configuration of that one being, or some kind of determination of it. And so you can conceive of them as a series of gradations of being, or even light, different kinds of light. And this will become a system of, this will become a system in the philosopher Mula Sadra, in his system, which also borrows from Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, the idea of light. And so the objects of existence are just gradations of being, in the same way that the different lights are gradations of luminosity. So what has more being is therefore more real, and what has less being is less real. Another metaphor that's used to explain wahdat al-wujud is a series of funhouse mirrors. Every object of existence is a reflection of the one entity and reality, in the same way that if you put a candle in the middle of a room and you surround that candle with different mirrors, this was the best image I could get. But now imagine in your mind that each mirror is different size, different shape, and different clarity, right? You therefore perceive that there are a number of candles, and a number of different candles according to the shape and size of the mirror, whereas those are just different reflections of the one candle. So therefore, each image reflects God, but the image is by definition non-existent. And this is one of the fundamental tenets of wahdat al-wujud that might be misunderstood by people, right? The things themselves don't have existence, which is why there's only one being. Only God has existence. The image by definition is non-existent in comparison with its object of reflection. God is the only one who has wujud. It is not to say, and is not to argue for a kind of pantheism, for example, or the accusations that are brought up in the polemical writings, hululi. There's this kind of incarnationism in which God indwells in creation. No, because creation doesn't exist itself by itself. Its wujud is a reflection of God's wujud. The things themselves are non-existent. They cannot.
It seems to be. It sounds a bit like that. The created universe that we know is an illusion. It has no substantiality, has no reality. If it's merely a reflection, it has no. It's not that it is independently existent, but it has no exist. It's not contingent on a necessary being. It has no. It's not even contingent because it's nothing at all. It's almost like an extreme version of contingency, such that the universe doesn't even exist. It's like with a candle analogy. Would that be I mean, this word non-existent is
it does conjure up that image, but the one thing you would add to that is that Ibn Arabi does not believe in a kind of a radical non-existence of the universe in which everything is completely non-existent. It is non-existent in itself except for what it manifests of God's wujud, and what of God's wujud becomes manifest, his attributes and his actions. And that is why the Sufis talk about the tawheed, the unity of the essence, the divine essence, the unity of God's attributes, the unity of his sifat, and the unity of God's actions, his af'al. Therefore, there is a reality to the universe, but it's God's reality. That's the difference. If you're trying to find a reality that is outside of God, it is non-existent.
No, it's not. I mean, just to be very prosaic for a second, can we just talk about a tree, any tree, yes. A tree in Jordan, a tree in London. What is a tree in Ibn Arabi's metaphysics? I mean, no Muslim would say the tree has independent existence. It's a contingent entity that is dependent on God for its existence. But it seems to me Ibn Arabi is saying more than that. He's saying more than just it is a contingent reality. He's simply saying that it is in some way non-existent. In what sense is that tree non-existent?
It is non-existent as a being that is separate from God. Its being, its wujud, is not separate from the wujud of God. Why? Because the tree is simply manifesting the attributes of God.
What attributes of God is the tree manifesting then?
His divine names. Whatever divine names are relevant to that tree. So for example, if the tree is providing food, it's manifesting the name Ar-Razaq, the nourisher, right? If the tree has a degree of life to it, it is manifesting the divine name, the one who is living, Al-Hayy.
Right.
And so on and so forth. If you have someone who's smart, he's manifesting the divine name Al-Alim, the knowing, the knower, and so on and so forth. You cannot look around existence except you will find God's attributes that belong to him. And therefore the things are manifesting those attributes. So the other technical terms, so you asked what would Ibn Arabi describe it, right? That means getting into his technical vocabulary, but he would describe the tree as a tajalli, a self-disclosure of God's sifat, his attributes, and the tree is thus a madhar, a locus of manifestation, a locus of manifestation for those attributes. That is all it is, right? How is that the case? That is the case as a result of the tree's ayn thabita, which is its fixed entity, or its immutable entity, which is the object of knowledge as God knows it from pre-eternity.
Okay, I get all that, but it seems to be it still falls short of the particularity of the tree. It's talking about the attributes of the tree, their manifestations of the divine.
Yes.
I think I understand what you're saying, but that still doesn't give us a tree in the sense of a thing made of bark with leaves that's in my back garden or my whatever. That seems to be slightly more than just this abstract conception of names manifest in this. The treeness, qua tree, seems to be missing from that description, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I think, I'd have to think about it a little bit, like what is it that makes this thing a tree in itself? It would be the Ain Thabita, its fixed entity. In addition to other things too, but why the fixed entity? Why the Ain Thabita? Because your fixed entity is not the same as my fixed entity, and that's what differentiates us. The objects of God's knowledge are distinct. They're distinct. They are not the same. What makes you, and what makes me, is the extent to which we can accept a certain degree of being or wujud and the attributes of God. So it's a combination, a matrix combination of the divine names. So you get this melange, and then that gives the person its own particularity, for example. And there's more to it than that, but it's a long subject.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So there are three epistemological sources for identifying God with wujud. It can either be done through naql, revelation, aql, the intellect, or kashf, which is unveiling, the lifting of the veils, and what is called dhawq and asrar. This kind of like spiritual tasting that for Ibn al-Arabi and the Sufis belongs to the prophetic legacy. And so if you were to perceive reality as it is by what is called lifting the veils, you would see behind the veils that the things are that the wujud of those things is God's wujud, and they are ultimately in their ontological source, they are God in reality. How is it justified? Through revelation. So Ibn Arabi would justify it with reference to certain verses, like wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God, and then he would explain that as saying, and the face of a thing is its reality. So its reality is God, right? And then if you say something like, he is the first and the last, the outward and the inward, al-awwal wal-akhir wal-dhahir wal-batin. If you say that, then that pretty much sums up everything, because God is the outward dimension of everything, and he is its inward dimension too, right? Now, wujud doesn't just mean being, but it also connotes other terms like finding and ecstasy, right? The ecstasy you get from finding a lost camel, for example. And that therefore connects to wijdan, which translates to consciousness and perception. So wujud and being is about not just a static kind of being, but the act of finding God in existence. So this is, I guess, one of the major appealing points to Wahdat al-Wujud, because it answers the question of, can God be known, can he be found, and can God be experienced? And so the whole point of that is that he can be experienced in the here and the now. Yes, basically. God as Wujud is a being that can be found, known, and experienced in any object of existence in at least some manner. And then Sadruddin al-Quni will say, Wujud, Ibn al-Arabi will say, the Lord remains the Lord, Abdun. The Lord remains the Lord, and the servant remains the servant. There's no intermixing of the realities. And why is there no intermixing? Because creation is ma'dum, is non-existent. Now, the practitioners of Ibn Arabi's school will explain the structure of wujud with something called the maratib al-wujud, which is the degrees of being, the different layers of existence, right? But you can broadly divide them into two levels, what is called the ahadiyya, and what Shir translates as the exclusive unity. The ahadiyya is this level of singularity. It is the level of God which cannot be spoken about and cannot be known, right? And that's related to a Quranic verse, the last verse of Surah Al-Kahf. which says, do not associate in the worship of your Lord with anyone. But if you read in Arabic, وَلَا تُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا, and he does not associate anyone in the worship of his Lord, anyone, أَحَدًا, which brings up the connotation that God can not be known in his ahadiyya. He cannot be worshipped in his ahadiyya. So his oneness, this singularity, excludes you. The figure that you're worshiping is from the wahadiyya, what's called the inclusive unity. And that's to do with God's divine names, the cosmos, as God's self-disclosures, his tajalliyat, and the cosmos as his madahir, his loci of manifestation, precisely because the cosmos is non-existent in relation to God. Thus, you say things like, there is no light but his light, no mercy but his mercy, no food or provision but his food, and therefore no being but his being. So that's a very brief, if inadequate, summary of Wahdat al-Wujud, which really needs a long time to explain in detail. So that's one controversial issue. So following on from that is the second controversial issue to do with this bliss that is experienced in hell, or the idea that there is the non-eternity of suffering. Suffering is not eternal, or punishment is not eternal for the people of hell. So what does Ibn al-Arabi say about that? So first of all, Ibn al-Arabi acknowledges punishment. He does not deny it at all. It exists. But his argument is just that it can't be forever. Why? He says that after a lengthy period, even after thousands of years, whatever the period is, the punishment eventually turns into bliss and becomes pleasurable. God will make the fire cool for its inhabitants. So what is that based on? It's based on a literal reading, which takes you into hermeneutics of literalism. It is based on a literal reading of such verses as, my mercy embraces all things. وَرَحْمَتِي وَاسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. My mercy embraces all things. And another verse which says, O my servants who have been immoderate against yourselves, do not despair of the mercy of God, for God forgives the sins, all of them, jamia. So that's what he's basing himself on, right? And now, if we get into his Quranic hermeneutics, he plays on the semantic roots on certain words, what's called the trilateral roots of Arabic words that contain a number of possibilities. So God threatens the associators, the polytheists and the unbelievers, the mushrikun kafirun, with his adab. And that word is mentioned in the Quran. But then Ibn al-Arabi says, but eventually the adab becomes urlub. It becomes sweet. Therefore, the punishment itself contains its ability to become pleasurable, just as that word adab contains this word itself, urlub. Why? Why does he say that? The warnings against the folk of the fire, who stay there permanently, are real. Punishment is real. But the Quran is written in Arabic, and therefore uses Arabi or Arabic idioms, expressions, and ideas. So he has a certain way of reading the Quran. What does this mean? Based on this knowledge of language, there's a distinction to be made between God's promise and his threat, the wa'ad and the wa'id. Now, Ibn al-Arabi's understanding of the Quran is based on this extremely classical ancient Arabic and the fact that God is talking to these desert Arabs in their language. So therefore, when the Quran talks in their language, it uses their expressions as well. So that's why people study pre-Islamic poetry, to get a better understanding of the Quran itself. The study of pre-Islamic poetry leads to a better understanding of the Quran. So one of the poems that the ancient Arabs wrote is, whenever I vow or swear, I forego my threat, but I will always fulfill my promise. So if I say that I promise to punish you and I will do such and such, it is from the Arabic language, that you don't need to carry out your threats. It's called a threat, right? And to me, that's comparable to this English saying, I told you 100 times, whereas it's understood that you did not tell me exactly numerically 100 times about such and such. You told me a certain number of times, probably a lot of times, right? So in other words, it's a threat. God does not have to carry out his threat, but his promise has to be kept according to the Arabic language. So that's one argument. And then there's other proofs as well. Ibn al-Arabi, I mean, this isn't exactly a proof, but he just talks about how the whole of existence is a circle. So if the affair begins with mercy, it needs to end with mercy as well. And then he says, so when the period of punishment is over and what's called the hukm of rahmah takes place, the property of mercy becomes manifest in hell, they then enjoy themselves in hell. These individuals who remain in hell, if they were to enter the garden with the constitutions that they have, they would suffer chastisement because of the garden's equilibrium. And this is his other argument, that because the people of the fire are made from a different constitution, they would not find felicity in the garden, but they find it in the fire. So because God is Ar-Rahman and the All-Merciful, and he promises that his mercy will embrace all things, then his mercy will come to encompass the people of the fire as well. And so Ibn Arabi takes this idea of rahmah very seriously. It forms the core of his doctrine. It forms the core of his doctrine in addition to the Sharia, and in addition to the law. So he says, I saw a group of those who dispute concerning the all-embracingness of God's mercy, maintaining that it is confined to a specific faction. They curtailed and constricted what God had made all-embracing. If God were not to have mercy on any of his creatures, he would forbid his mercy to those who say this. But God refuses anything but his mercy's all-inclusiveness, even to those who would curtail it. So that's the issue of the non-eternality of punishment. And so when it comes to the faith of Pharaoh, this is, of course, the next issue. You were asking about, doesn't the Quran, did you say that it calls him an unbeliever, or that he dies an unbeliever?
Well, I think he was both, wasn't he?
He was an unbeliever, but
well, he dies a believer in the end, in the sense that he acknowledges that the God of the people of Israel is the true God, but is not accepted by God. He dies a kafir. He's not he's still dismissed. He's not accepted as a believer in terms of his status. I mean, if I've understood that correctly. So yes, he does utter the words of faith, but his faith is too late. It's not accepted.
Right. And that is the classical position, and that is the classical understanding. So Ibn Arabi's understanding differs from the classical position for various reasons, but it's to do with what I might call a story that he understands with regard to Pharaoh, that leads up to that moment. So for Ibn al-Arabi, and this will take a long time to explain, but there's a good article on the subject by Denis Griel with regard to Pharaoh's faith. But the idea for Ibn al-Arabi is that Pharaoh always believed in the prophets, but he didn't have the courage to openly profess his faith in front of his people, right? And then there's reasons for that. But with regard to the specific moment of his death, so Ibn al-Arabi looks at these verses. So and he tackles pretty much all of them. But if you look at this one, for example, when he says, but as Pharaoh was drowning, he cried out, I believe that there is no God except that in whom the children of Israel believe. And I am now one of those who submit. One of the questions that arises is, was he sincere or not in his declaration? And the scholars who refute Ibn Arabi's arguments will argue that he wasn't even being sincere, right? But for Ibn al-Arabi, the declaration was sincere. It was sincere. And the reason it was sincere is because when the children of Israel were walking in the Red Sea and the ocean parted, and he saw with his eyes what the power of their faith could do, that's when he wanted to repent. And so the words came out as the waves were crashing in around him. So now there's this dialogue in which Ibn al-Arabi interprets God as speaking to Fir'aun. And so the words say, now, but you were disobedient before, and were one of those who sowed corruption. Now, what Ibn al-Arabi says is something really interesting. I don't know if I actually mentioned the actual verse, but so God says, Al-an, now you want to repent? The word now is not a rejection. It's not a rejection of his faith. It's more of a criticism of his faith. Ibn al-Arabi gives the example of another verse that addresses the Bedouin Arabs. And when they said, we believe, then God rejects that they believe and says, no, you do not believe, but you have submitted yourselves. You are Muslims, but you have not attained to faith yet. So Ibn Arabi does this inter-Quranic comparison in which he shows here that his faith isn't being rejected. It's just being criticized. But you were disobedient before. In other words, in the past, but not now. So your disobedience belongs to the past. It's in the past tense. But
I guess, yeah, so I guess it depends how you translate the Arabic. I mean, looking at Abdul-Halim's translation.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
when you had always been a rebel and a troublemaker, thus his sincerity is in question. Today, we shall save only your corpse as a sign to all posterity, suggesting that the only thing that will be saved about Pharaoh will be his body, not him, that he's lost, he's not saved. That's how one reading in the English, obviously, it's not the Arabic.
Yes. And of course, you could certainly read it that way. Ibn Arabi is very much, so this brings up the question of his hermeneutics. He's very much a literalist. If you want to argue for him that Pharaoh is damned, you need a verse that says you are in the fire. That's what he needs in order to accept that he is damned. But there's a lot of ambiguity. And so he takes advantage of the ambiguity, and he'll show you where the ambiguity is in these verses. Even the Abdul-Halim translation you read, you have always been, still refers to the past. But now you're not. And you're one of those who sowed corruption, but now you're not. And today,
it's the only thing that would be saved. So the thing about the problem about literalism is it doesn't take into account idiom. Idiom suggests things which are not explicitly stated, but they're stated, but not explicitly. It doesn't mean they're absent or they're just not there. That would be an overly formal and literalist kind of denial of the way language works. But one can imply things without being explicit, I think, and it still be meaningful communication. It's not just nothing.
Of course. And he is familiar with those idioms. Absolutely. I would say that what he has is a sophisticated literalism. But what he wants to show you is that it's not an open and shut case, that he's definitively damned. There's a possibility that he's saved. And then in his own opinion he is saved, but he's showing you where the ambiguities lie. So if we look at this verse, he says, today we shall save your body, that you may be a sign for whoever comes after you. He doesn't say why. You may be a sign. Ibn Arabi reads that as being so that you may be a sign of hope for whoever goes to excess and wrongs himself and wants to repent. You are a sign for that person, that this person can still repent, right? According to these verses. But most people are heedless of our signs. Most people don't know about this sign, and they think of it as something else. And of course, if you want to interpret the verse as no, it means we should save your body and you'll be a sign of God's wrath, you can. That's the point of the ambiguity. He doesn't say what he's a sign of. That's the literalism. He doesn't say what you're a sign of. That's up to you to figure out. And there's many other verses in the Quran that you need to consider when talking about Fir'aun's faith. So for example, there's another verse that says, Fir'aun shall lead his people to the fire. That seems pretty explicit, right? But then Ibn al-Arabi will argue, yeah, but it doesn't say that he enters it with them. He doesn't say he enters it with them, right? And that's kind of his methodology, if you like. And then just the basis for those interpretations is that God is too merciful to reject the plea of someone on the brink of drowning. Now you've got another verse as well that talks about what's called Hadrat al-Maut, when you're on the verge of death. So God has said in another verse that when someone is on the verge of death, what's called Hadrat al-Maut, but literally when you're in the presence of death, God doesn't accept repentance at that point. And that's also one of the verses that's used to justify that Pharaoh was damned, because wasn't he in the presence of death? Ibn Arabi, he counters that and says no, because Pharaoh wasn't sure that he was going to die. He thought that his faith would be able to enable him to cross the sea the way the faith of the children of Israel allowed them to part the sea. He wasn't sure of dying in that moment. He wasn't sure. That, so it's just playing on that ambiguity. And again, he's not arguing that you're wrong and I'm right. He's just trying to expose the number of possibilities that are contained in these verses. And then he's got his own interpretation of them. So, for example, there's a hadith, well-known hadith, in which Gabriel tries throwing mud on Pharaoh to stop him from completing the Shahada, bearing testimony to God's unity and his repentance. But then Ibn Arabi ties the hadith to the Quran, because Pharaoh does say the words, I believe there's no God except that in whom the children of Israel believe in, which means the mud did not reach his mouth, right? So he plays on this interconnection between inter-Quranic verses and Quran and hadith. And then he just goes on as well, but I don't want to prolong the discussion. And then comes the question of this universality of faith, in which if you argue that God is wujud, then it is therefore an implication that none is worshipped but God, whether this person knows it or not. That would be the implication if you argue that God is wujud. So therefore, all beings worship God, whether they admit it or not, whether they know it or not. Now, this is again based on an interpretation of this Quranic verse. وَقَضَىٰ رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدَ إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ. And thy Lord has decreed that you worship none but him. And Ibn Taymiyyah criticizes him for this and says he doesn't agree with his reading of the word decreed. Now, decreed can have the meaning of commanded. God commands you that you should not worship anyone but him. Ibn Arabi accepts that. You are commanded not to worship anyone but God. But he also says the word also means ja'ala. He has made it such that you worship none but him. And this is to do, he even ties that to God's jealousy, his ghira, that there should be anything else worshipped but him. And there isn't for Ibn al-Arabi. So there is none worshipped but God. And therefore, as a result, he differentiates between two commands, what's called the prescriptive command and the existential command. This is al-amr al-tashri'i, the prescriptive command in which God commands you to worship only him. And then the existential command, al-amr al-wujudi, I think, or no, I think it's got a different word, but anyways, in which God has made it such that you worship none but him. And then that also ties back to the other verses in the Quran, like wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. But we do need to be careful. Ibn al-Arabi is a scholar of the law. He's not saying it's okay to worship other things or to take other objects of worship, even if they are ultimately God. It's only permissible to worship God in accordance with the Sharia. So how does the Sharia permit you to worship God? That's the only thing that's permitted. It's just a reality. It's just a fact that it is none other than God, right? But he's not arguing.
I mean, I don't want to get into a debate about how we read these verses. Again, looking at the Abdul-Halim verse, it says, your Lord has commanded that you should worship none but him and that you be kind to your parents. So if one takes that in the straightforward sense, that he's commanded two things prescriptively, that you worship none by him and that you be kind to your parents. He's not switching prescriptive existential to prescriptive. That would be a kind of an odd way of expressing it. It's not kind of a natural way of the flow in the East in the English. So they both seem to be prescriptive commands. But if you isolate that phrase as you've done there on that slide, then of course it could be either existential or prescriptive. But I'm just saying, in the larger context, it would appear to me as a layman who knows nothing.
Yes. No, but by the way, Paul, that's such a fantastic point, because Ibn Arabi does that all the time. Although I wouldn't use the word isolate, but yes, he does this kind of thing all the time. What is his justification for it? Well, he says that there is an outer. So he bases himself on hadith to explain his Quranic hermeneutics. There is an outward meaning to the Quran, and there's a batin, there's an inward meaning to the Quran, and there is, if I remember correctly, there is a had, a limit to the Quran, and there's a matla', a point of ascension in which you see the horizons that are contained in the Quran. And there's another hadith that states that there are 7 outward meanings and 7 inward meanings as well. The point being that for Ibn al-Arabi, each part of the divine word is just packed with so much power with regard to its interpretation. So he would not deny at all that you are commanded to worship your Lord and to do good to your parents. He wouldn't deny that at all. But there can be different layers on top of that command that does not contradict that command. His only rule is that when you read Quran, you shouldn't contradict the grammar. You should not go outside the grammar of the Quran, as long as the grammar is contained in the language, right? As long as your interpretation is justified by the language and the grammar, then you're fine, right? Mm-hmm. And as long as you don't contradict its outward sense, the outward sense cannot be contradicted, but you can find additional meanings to the outward sense. So that would be his hermeneutics.
Okay.
So then he says that, well, what is a belief for him to begin with, right? Which is to do with the word al-i'tiqadat, beliefs or belief systems. And it comes from the word aqda, which means to knot, tie, or contract something. And specifically to tie a knot in the heart. So a belief is that thing which you tie in your heart. And beliefs govern our perception of reality and define the boundaries of what we recognize or deny as because of what our heart knots. So then the heart either accepts a certain belief or it rejects a certain belief. But one of his core principles in that area is that God manifests himself to you in the form of your belief, again, based on certain Quranic verses as well. And so he comes up with a concept called the haqq al-makhluq fil i'tiqadat, the God who is created in people's beliefs. So in other words, God takes the form of your belief in accordance with in accordance with the knotting in your heart. So for him, every object of worship is ultimately God. Even every object of praise is God, just as every beloved is none other than God. And we've already gone through his hermeneutics. So one of the verses he talks about is he is the one who prays over you. So God is the one, if you translate it this way, he is the one who prays over you. هو الذي يصلي عليكم. هو الذي يصلي عليكم. Now, in Jahili, in pre-Islamic Arabic, there is the musalli. So yusalli is the verb for him praying over you. هو الذي يصلي عليكم. He prays over you. But the raw meaning, the more basic meaning of the musalli is not the one who prays, although he can be the one who prays. But the musalli in that classical Arabic is the horse runner who comes second in the race. Therefore, with that meaning in mind, you could read the verse. And the reason he says that is because Ibn Arabi is not playing around with the Quran and being mischievous, but it's based on the idea that God's words cannot be exhausted. Therefore, the means of the Quran cannot be exhausted. So he goes to Surah Al-Kahf, and he says that the words of God cannot be spent. And another verse, if you took 7 oceans and all the trees were pens, you can never exhaust the words of Quran. That's where this idea is coming from.
I mean, indeed. The reason I feel a bit twitchy about this is, apart from my poverty of spiritual intuition, I'm sure, but having been a Christian in the past, who took a great interest in the Bible, the way New Testament writers and Christians interpret Old Testament passages in the Jewish Bible, Isaiah 53, etc., etc., would be very much in the spirit of this. Well, Isaiah may have made Isaiah 53 may be about Israel at a historical level, but at a deeper level, it's really about Jesus' crucifixion. You see, and you get the what one WAG scholar called not Easter Jesus, but I see Jesus. Literally, they see Jesus all over the Bible because they want to see him. And they can come up with this. You had the primary and a secondary meaning, and this is actually spoken of in particularly in Catholic scholarship, where they acknowledge the historical meaning and also a further meaning which is fulfilled in Christ. So the Jewish scriptures are Christianized basically in a way that no Jew would ever accept, because this is not, that they would stick to the literal meaning. Moses isn't talking about Jesus; he's talking about whatever, and so. I've always, in my Muslim year, felt very suspicious of these overly Christianized interpretations of passages which support Christian doctrines like the incarnation, the Trinity, and the crucifixion of Jesus. And that's why I had this hesitancy in simply going along with this, even though there may be justifications for it in some way that you are outlining. So that's my misgiving anyway.
No, absolutely. And you know what, to be fair, Paul, some of the scholars who came after Ibn al-Arabi had the same concerns as well. I would just say that it needs to be justified by the grammar of the Arabic that's in the Quran, at least for Ibn al-Arabi. But certainly other scholars who came after him also had similar concerns. So, but with regard to this slide then, the Musalli is the horse runner who comes second in the race. So therefore, with that being in mind, he is the one who comes after you in your belief. Thus, God appears to you in the form of your belief for Ibn al-Arabi. Now, there's many quotes we could cite to discuss the polemical attacks against Ibn al-Arabi, but this is just one example, which concerns, of course, of all books, the Fusus al-Hikam. And then Ibn Taymiyyah says, these individuals, the reincarnationists, practitioners of Wahdat al-Wujud, praise misguidance, confusion, oppression, error, and chastisement, with which God destroyed nations, and furthermore, invert the meaning of the words of God and his messengers, such that minds necessarily know is corruption. And this, all of it, is the ugliest substitution and distortion of God's word. So definitely other scholars have had misgivings, but I do think there could be an exaggeration with regard to perceiving Ibn al-Arabi's intentions, right? Whether one agrees with his methodology or not. And it's just extraordinary that the overwhelming majority of the attacks go back to the Fusus, even though Ibn al-Arabi has written more than 300 books. So Nabulsi, in defense of Ibn al-Arabi, says that, listen, his arguments are always based on the Quran and a very deep understanding of the Quran and its language, and the Sunnah and the Islamic tradition in general. So if you argue that Ibn Arabi's books should be burnt, then you just be burning up a good portion of the Quran, right? But if you argue, no, let's just wash out the Quran verses, then burn the book, it would no longer be Ibn al-Arabi's work because it's just so intertwined with the Quran itself. So it just seems to me that we can ask the question, what is at the heart of some of these attacks and this vilification of Ibn al-Arabi? And I think it is to do with the fear of antinomianism. This idea that someone's spirituality can nullify the law, right? Now, there is an example of this fear illustrated in a very cartoonish way, in which Ibn Ahdal, one of his major opponents, if you like, says that, look, this wall is God because of Wahdat al-Wujud. Or he says, one of those Sufis used to fornicate with the wife of their companion, telling her, "We are all one man on account of oneness," which I'm pretty sure Ibn al-Arabi would never condone in any way, shape, or manner, to be fair to Ibn al-Arabi. So that raises an important question. What are his critics arguing for? Because it's important to be clear about that. Are his critics suggesting that Ibn Arabi is directly arguing for such behavior, or are they saying that his teachings inevitably lead to this kind of behavior, even if he is not being explicit about it? And therefore, is it possible to nullify the law? And is it possible to further abrogate the Muhammadan Sharia by saying, I'm spiritually advanced, and therefore I can create my own law? For Ibn Arabi, at least, this is completely impossible. It's not possible in any way, shape, or form. So he says that God has locked the door of angelic descent with rulings of the law, but he has not locked the door of descent with knowledge of those rulings into the hearts of the friends. So you cannot receive new ahkam of the Sharia, but you can receive new understandings of the ahkam that are already there, right? Which feeds into his hermeneutics. And then he says, this way is indicated by the words of Junayd. This knowledge of ours is delimited by the book, the Quran, and the Sunnah. And that is our scale. That is the mizan. And hence, the knowledge of the friend never leaves the book and the Sunnah in any way. If someone should leave them, that is not knowledge, nor is it knowledge of friendship. On the contrary, when you verify it, you will find it to be ignorance, and ignorance is non-existence, while knowledge is verified existence. He goes back to what is wujud and what is non-existence. The friend is never commanded to follow a knowledge within which there is a law giving which abrogates his law. That would never happen. Mm-hmm. And so each friend's unveiling in the divine science does not go beyond that which is given by the scripture and revelation of his prophet. In this station, Junayd said, this knowledge of ours is delimited by the book and the Sunnah. And another one said, every unveiling that's not borne witness to by the book and Sunnah is nothing, and it is to be rejected. And so this is why scholars say that we can also characterize Ibn al-Arabi's hermeneutic as a method of adab, the highest adab, having respect for the adab of the Quran, which is where this it's not a total, where this quasi-literalism comes from. Be precise with regard to what God says and what he leaves out. That's part of his adab, this etiquette and manners with God. And then the other dimension to his methodology is having mercy towards others and having steadfast rigor towards oneself. These are the defining poles of Ibn al-Arabi's ethics. So just in summary, then, we can say Ibn Arabi was raised and shaped by the scholarly environment common to most ulama, and he takes the Sharia clearly very seriously, but he cannot be approached in any superficial manner, which is sometimes tends to be the want of certain polemics. And he remains a formidable scholar in his own right, and in the eyes of his followers, one of the major saints, if you like. So those are the controversies. And now we can go into the book very briefly and just get a very brief preview of the book.
An amazing preview. I'm very grateful for that, actually. Very enlightening.
Thank you very much. So my book is to do with the question of Ibn Arabi's view on the religions and whether he is religiously pluralistic or not. Does he advocate for a pluralism or not? And the reason for that question is that because, of course, as one might infer from the question, there is a disagreement concerning this issue in academia and amongst the traditional ulama. Not everyone agrees as to what Ibn al-Arabi is exactly advocating for. But regardless, it pretty much tends to surround this one passage. This one passage is a good example and a nice summary of his views on the other religions. So what does he say? Despite the massive amounts of things that he writes about them. So this is an anchor passage. So what does he say? He says, all the revealed religions of the Sharia are lights. Among these religions, the revealed religion of Muhammad ﷺ is like the light of the sun. among the lights of the stars. When the sun appears, the lights of the stars become hidden, and their lights are included in the light of the sun. Their being hidden is like the abrogation of the other revealed religions which he subscribes to. He subscribes to the doctrine of abrogation that takes place through Muhammad's revealed religion. Nevertheless, they do in fact exist, just as the existence of the light of the stars is actualized. Like if the sun rises, intellectually the stars are still present. This explains why we have been required in our all-inclusive religion to have faith in the truth of all messengers and all the revealed religions. They are not rendered null, batil by abrogation. That is the opinion of the ignorant. Now, this passage is translated by William Sheddick, and it comes from his book, Imaginal Worlds. My own book is in some ways a continuation in dialogue with that book.
I just note this repeated expression, all the revealed religions. So it's not saying all religions as such are lights. For example, Mormonism. I mean, not that he knew anything about Mormonism, but assuming for the second is a bogus religion in the sense of Prophet Joseph not being a genuine prophet at all, which would presumably be Ibn Arabi's belief, because he believed that Muhammad, upon him be peace, was the seal of the prophets, as the Quran says. Then Mormonism is not a real revealed religion, and thus it's not included in this solar metaphor. Would that be a fair conclusion?
Yes and no. Yes and no.
That's very clear.
I'll tell you why. You are correct insofar as it does not come under the category of Sharia. So the Mormonism and some of these religions that appear after the final coming of Muhammad's religion are not considered divinely revealed, since he considers the law to be sealed and shut. It's done.
Yeah, exactly.
It's done. He still has a way of including what are called other man-made laws, other man-made paths, but he uses a different word for that. He calls them nawamis. And nawamis are taken into account. And that needs an explanation. But that's the summary of it. So you're right. Won't be.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this in your book. I was just wondering, this is not a man-made law. I'm talking. Mormonism is not a man-made law. It's a promotion of an individual who would be considered to be a false prophet. That's not a man-made law. That is a claimant to to revelation on behalf of Joseph Smith, the 19th century United States, of course. That's not quite what I was saying. I wasn't saying, well, maybe there were some laws he brought as well. To be honest, I have no idea. I don't really care. But it's this central claimant to revelation as a revealed religion that I was focusing on, because that is really the essence of it, that Joseph Smith was an actual prophet of God. But actually, when you look at the content and what he taught, it was so different from Christianity and Islam and Judaism. It's a very odd religion indeed. So do you see what I mean? That's what I was getting at. So that's not like human custom and law where we invent, laws just to have a society. That this is to do with a claim to revelation. That's what I meant.
It would be really interesting to ask the question of what would Ibn al-Arabi think about Mormonism and Joseph, because, I mean, despite his claims to being a prophet in the Christian understanding and sense of the word, right? Despite his claims to being a prophet, his base religion, which Christians would argue he has deviated from, right? Yeah. He has deviated from the basis of Christianity as understood by Catholicism, Greek Orthodoxy, or Protestantism, for example. Yeah. What would Ibn Arabi think about that? Because his base religion is Christianity, which he has deviated from. So he would then be judged on the basis of that law, and his understanding of what reached him, right? Because now we get into the question of what's called taklif, which is to do with, I think I translate the word as kind of like what God commands you to do and forbids you from doing. It's the word taklif is very interesting because it's to do with what's called God's emburdenment, if you like. It's to do with what he charges you with, what he requires from you. So according to your understanding of Christ's law, what did Christ require from you? And if you deviate from that law, what's your justification for it? that's something he'd be asked for, right? Without going into the actual details of Mormonism, right? And what is perceived to be a false religion.
Okay.
But that's, of course, super fascinating. So with regard to the solar metaphor, there are generally two camps in terms of understanding the passage. You can have a relatively inclusivist understanding of the passage, in which all the religions are lights. And of course, what does he say? He says that this explains why we have been required in our all-inclusive religion to have faith in the truth of all messengers. They're not rendered null by abrogation. Abrogation does not make the previous laws batil. But there is a more exclusivist understanding of the passage, which suggests, yes, that's the position of Islam in general. There's nothing special about that. You're still required to follow the law of Muhammad ﷺ and therefore undergo a kind of a confessional conversion. That is a requirement. This passage does not definitively give you what you're arguing for. So I look at the different positions that are taken on this passage. So my understanding is that actually you could argue for a third position and an interpretation of those passages. But to do that, you'd have to understand what's going on in that passage to begin with. And just very briefly, I would say that there's two things happening, a dual mechanism, what's called fana and baqa, annihilation and subsistence. Because it is true that the lights of the stars are being annihilated, but Ibn Arabi is arguing that they still somehow continue to subsist. So it's actually both. The question is how. How is it both? So therefore, in the book, I go through the way in which they are annihilated. After that, the following chapter, I go through the way in which they subsist. And then once I've explained that position, then I give my own conclusion, which we'll come to in a minute, of what is precisely Ibn al-Arabi's stance on religious pluralism. But first, we need to take a look at the way in which they are annihilated. And this is really such a small preview of a much, much larger subject, which is given in the book. So we'll only go through this very briefly. So here we go. Ibn al-Arabi is, first of all, explicit about abrogation, and he believes in it. You cannot say that he denies abrogation. That would be incorrect.
So when you say denies abrogation, so what, in layman's language, what do you mean? You mean the previous legal systems or of the previous religions, like the Jewish religion and the Christian religion?
Yes, supersessionism.
Supersessionism. Yeah. Okay.
Islam supersedes the previous religions.
Right.
That is non-negotiable for Ibn al-Arabi and for any other Islamic scholar that I'm aware of.
So that's interesting when you say that about Ibn Arabi. I mean, about whom I know very little, but I've heard it said that he was a pluralist, and you know, but you're asserting very clearly that he was a supersessionalist, which is the normative Sunni position, I would think. So that marks him to be quite orthodox.
Yes, absolutely. But then his pluralism is kind of like a twist on that supersessionism. But the basis of his belief is supersessionism. That's the basis of it, for sure. Right. And he does not deny it. So what does he say? So he constructs a cosmological image, which is based on something called the Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya, which is called the Muhammadan reality. And this is what he says. So he says that Muhammad was like the brilliant sun from chapter 10 of the Futuhat. And all lights became included in his shining light. And all legal rulings or properties, depending on how you translate that word ahkam, became concealed within his own property. All the laws became subservient to him, and his mastery, previously hidden, became manifest. And so this siyad, this mastery, is of course an allusion to several factors, like he will be the Lord of the children of Adam on the day of judgment, for example, amongst other things. And so Ibn al-Arabi clearly adheres to the Quranic verse that says, we have not sent thee except to all people, right? Lil-nas kafatan, to all of them entirely. Because sometimes you'll find in the pluralistic discussions that, and so this happened in his own day and age, that someone will say, we acknowledge that Muhammad is a prophet, but he's a prophet for you, not for us. So Ibn Arabi will reject that. He'll say no. His mission's towards the whole of mankind, and therefore mankind and the whole of humanity are required and obligated to respond to him. So since Muhammad's mission encompasses the whole of mankind, so does his law, and by implication, its roots as well as its corollaries, the usul and the furu' of the Sharia. Therefore, the whole of humanity is addressed. They're mukhatabun. These are very important words. They are addressed and responsible for answering to the Sharia. So then Ibn Arabi will elaborate on that position, and he'll say, our position, because there are different positions, even in his day and age, is that all people, every single one of them, kafatan, it's the same word that you get in that verse right there. Believer, unbeliever, hypocrite, right? Is prescribed and addressed with following and applying the roots of the Sharia as well as its branches. And just for clarification for your viewers, the roots of the Sharia are to do with its fundamental foundations that pertains to for example, to Aqidah, belief in God, belief in His unity, belief in the day of resurrection, belief in His messengers, belief in the inviolability of His messengers. They cannot sin, and so on and so forth. That pertains to the very foundations of the Sharia. And they'll be answerable to the furu'ah, the commands to pray, the command to do wudu, the command to give zakat, and so on and so forth, which are dependent upon the foundations of the Sharia, the usul. They will be taken to task on the Day of Judgment for the roots and the branches. And there's so much more to be said, but that's what it is in a nutshell. Therefore, if you argue that the stars in that manner are annihilated, the previous religions, therefore, in that manner, are annihilated. And what remains is the Muhammadan Sharia. Therefore, how do they subsist, if at all? So, there's two themes I talk about in this chapter, but there's much more to be said. But briefly, the two pillars of this chapter are to do with the jizya and the rahmah. Historically, previous religious communities under Islamic rule have remained and were permitted to practice their religion by payment of the jizya. And the payment of the jizya is, of course, mandated by 929 in the Quran, which is the jizya verse, which commands that other faiths pay the jizya. Once they pay the jizya, they have the right to practice their religion. So Al-Arabi talks about that in this passage, and he gets into the problem of not believing in Muhammad. So this is a really important chapter from chapter 275 of the Futuhat. I've just taken like a snippet of it, but we'll just get into it here. So he says, the Ahl Kitab, who are the Christians and the Jews, malign a certain messenger, that's Muhammad. But why do they do that? They do it due to some sort of a whim or a suspicion, or you could translate the word as a doubt that is established within themselves that led them to deny God or the truth unjustly and condescendingly, even though they have certainty in Him, in God. But as for their suspicion, the truthfulness of the one inviting them to Islam, Sahab al-Da'wah, was not proven for them. This is his presupposition. He's giving you his presuppositions, whether we agree with it or not. So he's telling you the way he understands their inner psychology. And he's always sympathetic towards understanding the inner psychology, the way people think, the way people behave. So it is because of this that overall, they do have a correct basis and support, Musnad Sahih, as far as they are concerned, but not in the affair itself. The affair, it's completely wrong to say that one cannot believe in Muhammad. No, you have to, or for rejecting Muhammad. But they have a justification for doing so on the basis of what reached them, on the basis of what they are seeing. They are, therefore, nevertheless, protected from being fought against. So the jizya is levied upon them, and they are left to their religion to establish it, or some of it, according to the measure of success they are given in that. So then he says after that, here there's a delicate point for the one of understanding, and it is that their religion is lawful for them through our law, so that they are confirmed in it. So if you argue that the previous religions are abrogated, and Islam supersedes them. The question isn't whether they have any value or not, are they valid or not. The question becomes, how can they become practiced? How can one practice them, if you are, for example, a Junior Christian, through the Islamic Sharia? So therefore, it is up to the Prophet to give them permission to practice their religions. And so Ibn Arabi interprets the application of the jizya in 929 as permission for them to practice their religions. Once the law has confirmed confirmed and given them permission to practice their religion. So, but it's through the wider sense of the Sharia. So that would be Ibn al-Arabi's answer to that, and how you bring together this idea of abrogation, but the other religions also continuing to subsist nevertheless. They don't subsist by themselves. They subsist through the Sharia of Muhammad, right? So this is another nice way of explaining it. Whoever obeys the messenger, that is Muhammad, has thus obeyed God, and he is a mercy for all the worlds. Hence, all the worlds are included within him. So this is from Baha'u'ddin Baitar, and he's quite recent. So he says, so the protected minorities, Ahl Dhimma, are included in us as a community, or in Muhammad, just as all the worlds are included in him, if you're speaking cosmologically. So long as they give the jizya, the indemnity by hand, and are humbled. So therefore, God confirmed for the Christians what they were upon, for the gospel is included, mundaraj, it's the same word that Ibn al-Arabi uses. They are included in his Quran. How? God says, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has revealed in it. So if they judge by the gospel, they are not judging except by God's judgment, which he has sent down upon Muhammad. From this perspective, they are laboring under Muhammad's ruling and abiding by his command. And then Ibn Arabi talks about, again, the basis foundation for all his teachings, which is his belief in Rahmah. So then what does he say? He says that in the verse which says, we have sent thee not except as a mercy for all the worlds, Ibn Arabi says regarding that verse, God did not specify the believer over the others. That's his quasi literalism. God didn't say his mercy is only for the believers. It says it's for all the worlds. And this is confirmed. This is actualized in levying the jizya upon the Ahl Kitab, and levying this jizya tax on the Jews and Christians. The only reason for the descent of this verse, which is, we have sent thee not except as a mercy for all the worlds, is because of what's called the divine imprecation, du'a bil-mu'akhadha al-ilahiyya, that Muhammad wanted to make in this episode in the Seerah, when he sends his companions to teach these polytheistic tribes the Quran. They slaughter those companions. And so Muhammad, he wanted to pray against them. So then the verse was sent down upon him, and said, which basically said, don't pray against them, because we've only sent you as a mercy to all the worlds. So he wanted to make that imprecation against the associators, the mushrikun of Ra'al, Daqwan, and Asaya. So if the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, was censured for exercising his right, and it was his right, over the associator, the mushrik, of whom it was reported that God will not forgive him, then how is the affair with those who are not associators, even if they do not believe in Muhammad's prophethood? Right? That's, in a nutshell, this combination of annihilation and subsistence. The stars remain, but through the sun's light. In Ibn al-Arabi's metaphorical cosmology. So then, in the third chapter, I go into the arguments made by another scholar, Gregory Lipton, which we will not get into, but it's important to address them because his publication is the most recent publication on this issue. But I believe that he has a serious misunderstanding of Ibn al-Arabi's position. But for his part, he argues for a strongly exclusivist reading of Ibn al-Arabi. Then I provide my counter arguments as to why I think that's incorrect. But one of the issues that's central to the discussion is the issue of discussing the importance of perceiving God in other people's beliefs. Why does Ibn Arabi argue for it? Well, because it's a form of nasiha, giving good counsel to people who are on the spiritual path. So it's about what? Suluk, the spiritual path. And the basis of that, why does it matter on one spiritual path? It's because Ibn al-Arabi justifies it with a hadith from Sahih Muslim. It's also in Bukhari and other places as well. And it's called Hadith al-Tahawwul. And it's a really interesting hadith because there aren't that many commentaries on it. It's a bit of a strange hadith, but it is in Muslim and Bukhari amongst other places. So the hadith goes like this. On the Day of Judgment, God comes to people in a certain form that they don't recognize. And so he comes to them and says, I am your Lord. And then they reply, no, you're not. We seek refuge in God. We will wait here till our Lord comes. So then God goes away and transforms himself into the form they recognize that they think God is. Then he comes back to them. And then they say, yes, you are our Lord. But then he transforms himself into the first form during the first time to show them that the first form they recognized is the equivalent of the second form that they confirmed the second time. It is the same being, the same God. Ibn al-Arabi makes the point of that hadith and says that hadith is a reference to one's beliefs, the form of your belief, the form of your belief. So that is the reason for giving counsel about not rejecting other people's beliefs and not rejecting the perception of God's presence in them, because then you reap those fruits on the Day of Judgment. Now, we'll come to that in a second, but I feel that in the previous analyses of Ibn al-Arabi, there have been many passages that were omitted with regard to his religious pluralism that show that he was very inclined towards it, but within the bounds of the law, like we discussed previously, within the bounds of the law. So this is one example when he says that they're essentially Jewish and Christian saints. How many walk upon the earth, whilst the earth curses him, and how many prostrate upon her, but she does not accept it. And how many beloved saints is to be found in synagogues and churches, and yet how many hated enemies to be found in prayer rooms and mosques, who does this for the sake of that, but reckons he's working for himself, right? And then this passage goes into what's called the beatific vision. The whole point of recognizing other people's beliefs for Ibn al-Arabi, as far as he is concerned for the spiritual traveler, is that you reap the fruit of that through the beatific vision on the Day of Judgment. So then he says, the men who are the stalwarts, the highest saints, are those who concur with the belief of every believer in respect of that which has conveyed it to him, taught it, and established it. On the day of the visitation, the men will see their Lord with the eye of every belief. He who counsels his own soul should investigate, during his life in this world, all doctrines, maqala, concerning God. He should learn from whence each possessor of a doctrine affirms the validity of his doctrine. Once its validity has been affirmed for him in the specific mode in which it is correct for him who holds it, then he should support it in the case of him who believes in it. He should not deny it or reject it, for he will gather its fruit on the day of visitation, whatever that belief might be. So turn your attention to what we have mentioned and put it into practice. That would summarize it in a nutshell. So with this passage, which says, beware of delimiting yourself to a specific belief and disbelieving all else, for much good will pass you by. What is that good? The vision you'll acquire of God on the Day of Judgment. The more beliefs you have affirmed as containing God's presence, the more of God you'll perceive on the Day of Judgment. So be in yourself like the primordial matter of all forms of belief, since God, the Most High, is too wide and great to be restricted by one belief over another. And then similarly, he says, this is what the folk of Allah, the saints, seek, the Arifin, the Gnostics. And so once we've established that, then I go into the different ways in which Ibn al-Arabi can include other people of other faiths and the different methods of worship they have in Islam if it's done through the Sharia, once you understand his metaphysical basis, right? So then that's what the next two chapters are about, in essence. The reason this one is about sun worshippers in particular is because he actually talks about them. And no one's really looked at those passages before.
We actually met according to your book, he actually met a bunch of them, didn't he? These sun worshippers on his travels, and you comment sort of, it was very unusual for any sort of Muslim scholar to take these guys seriously, and actually reflect on what this meant for his worldview. So he did something that was quite unique. You in your book you say that. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly it. To be fair, there are other scholarly opinions that he never actually met them, but this is kind of like we might call it like a metaphorical demonstration to illustrate an argument. I don't buy it, because Ibn al-Arabi is very open about his methodology. He'll tell you if he sees something in a dream. He'll tell you if something's on his mind. He'll tell you if something happens in what's called the imaginal world. That's a whole other story. He'll be open about it. Okay. But if he's giving you mundane details about what has happened in his life, that's an indication that it physically happened. Which would be my argument. Anyways, so these are a list of examples of tools, Shari'i tools, that Ibn al-Arabi uses to be inclusive of other religions within the bounds of the law, since Muhammad's religion has abrogated the previous laws. So it's that Sharia that decides how they become included. The jizya is just one example. There are other examples. Of course, we're not going to go through them all of them, of course. Ijtihad and Nawamis are my two top choices. So let's take a brief look at the sun worshippers, right? Whom he meets in the lands of, not Greece, in these Anatolian lands, Bilad Yunan. It's not really Greece at all. So this happens in Turkey, modern day Turkey, right? Ibn al-Arabi is invited to have lunch with one of their scholars. And so Ibn al-Arabi asks him a question, and he says, why do you associate your worship of God with the worship of the sun? So he literally asks him, why are you doing shirk? That's a very reasonable question to ask. So then this supposed Greek scholar answers him, we do not worship the sun in as much as it is the sun. God forbid. God is one God. Our learned scholars simply investigated what benefits this most tremendous light, al-Nair al-Azim, has in the cosmos. And that could be an astrological term. Ibn al-Arabi says, he then enumerated the benefits God connected to the sun. So then this scholar continues. So from those benefits, we knew that if it did not have solicitude from God, this anaya, he would not have entrusted it to these matters. Hence, we seek nearness to the sun through veneration, ta'zim, that we may have a most beautiful intermediary with God for our deliverance. You could also translate that word as for our purification. For us, the sun is a poor slave of God Almighty. Indeed, it is through God that, quote unquote, he, the sun, is granted solicitude. This is what he said to me, Ibn al-Arabi continues, whilst we were sitting at his table, eating from his banquet, which is why I think this physically happened. And so Ibn al-Arabi calls this the prostration of ijtihad and exerting oneself to the utmost, badal al-mashhud, because what behooves God's majesty in glorifying and taking pleasure in him. So Ibn al-Arabi is calling this action a form of ijtihad. And it is ijtihad that sanctions the worship of a non-Islamic group or religion according to the Sharia. So does ta'zim, but that raises the question, why? Where does he get this from? Well, first of all, there is a hadith which states that the mujtahid who is doing ijtihad in a mas'ala, in an issue, he can either get it right or wrong. If he gets it right, he gets 2 rewards. If he gets it wrong, he only gets 1 reward, but he's still rewarded. So it is Ibn Arabi's understanding of that hadith that, again, reverting back to the quasi-literalism, the Prophet didn't specify whether you can only do ijtihad in the usul or the furu'. So firstly, ijtihad is permitted. Secondly, he doesn't specify if you can do ijtihad in the furu' or the usul, which is why Ibn Arabi's position on that, therefore, is that our position is that ijtihad is permitted in the principles and the legal rulings the corollaries of the Sharia, no difference. And so what that Greek sun worshipper was doing ijtihad, of course, in the usul, in the foundations of the Sharia, which according to Ibn Arabi is permitted to him. So now we tend to think of the hadith as being applied to fiqh, which it is. And Ibn Arabi himself understands that. He does not deny it. But then he uses that hadith as a framework for understanding other religions. It's not just about fiqh. It's about one's own personal struggle. So he has written elsewhere about how someone might reject his position and say, you think it only applies to the law. But in my understanding, it also applies to the spiritual itinerant, the salik, who cleanses the heart and opens it up to celestial revelations and lordly inspirations. That is also one of the means of ijtihad, the one who struggles to his utmost, intellectually, as this Greek scholar did, or spiritually. So for Ibn Arabi, that becomes permissible, according to the law. Now, ordinarily, in Islamic law, shirk is forbidden and punished. He accepts that. But then what does he say? But not every mushrik, not every associator. Rather, only the associators, only the mushrikun, who were sent messengers or did not give rational consideration its rightful due or strive. وَلَا أَجْتَهَدُوا. For the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, has reported that the striver, the mujtahid, if he errs, he is rewarded. He did not separate the branch from the root. He didn't differentiate. No, he generalized. So one can do ijtihad in either one, in any religious matter. So he therefore verified God's words, my mercy embraces everything in that manner, and my mercy has outstripped my wrath. So Ibn Arabi accepts all Quranic verses without a shadow of a doubt, and that the mushrik is punished, but not every mushrik, not everyone. Which goes back to the issue of, are you performing a form of worship that is through the Sharia or not? So ijtihad is through the Sharia. That would be his argument. The Emir al-Jazairi says the same thing. The folk of God, the ones who truly know him, are unanimous. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but anyways, that the mujtahid who strives in the usul issues that are not sufficed save by categorical certainty, I mean in intellectual matters, in creed, aqidah, is excused. He has an excuse. So for Ibn Arabi, there's clearly right and wrong, but you can be excused. He's ma'zur. Just as he would be excused in the furu'a if it's done through ijtihad, right? I.e. the issue of actions stipulated by law. And so he continues and explains more, but I've just cropped that out. The Emir al-Jazairi finishes that passage by saying, whoever God apprises of the nobility of this genus, the human species, and of his providential care for them, and how he singled them out by having the heavenly spheres subjected to them, and the prostration of the angels to them, would say, as we have said, it is not far-fetched at all as a favor from God. In Sahih Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ said, if the unbeliever were to know of all that which is with God of his mercy, he would never despair of paradise, right? And then we come to the last and final chapter, which is to do with the nawamis, laws that are man-made, and you've got to, again, have a basis in the Sharia for making them. They are called namus. What does Ibn Arabi use them for? He uses them especially to describe past sages, past paths which were used to find God that wasn't done through a prophetic law. They are non-prophetic laws, especially to do with the issue of what's called wise government, governing a people through the creation of your own laws. So he says, again, this is from Imaginal Worlds, Shidduch's book. God made these limits and customs of two kinds. One kind is called wise regulation, siyasat hikmiyah. He cast it into the original dispositions of the souls of the great human beings of the past. Ibn Arabi would consider Plato to be one of them, for example. Hence, they set down limits and established laws through a power that they found in their own souls. So by the way, just a side point, Al-Farabi gets into this issue, and it comes through Ibn Arabi as well. Al-Farabi translates what are called the laws of Plato, this dialogue that Plato wrote. But some people didn't treat as dialogue. They treat it as actual laws. So they're interpreted as actual laws created by Plato. But that's not the case. It's just a dialogue, right?
Yeah.
So Al-Farabi translates portions of that. Well, that reaches Ibn al-Arabi, and he comments on the laws, saying the person who enacts these laws, right? He is permitted to do so if there are no prophets. Who's that person? Plato. Even though Plato historically doesn't actually enact laws. But just the acceptance of that idea is very fascinating. So hence they set down limits and established laws through a power that they found in their own souls. They did so in every city, place, and clime, in accordance with what was demanded by the constitution and nature of those areas, since they knew what wisdom demanded. Through that, they preserved the possessions, lives, families, relatives, and kinship relationships. What are those? The maqasid al-sharia. That's also being used here. He uses the maqasid al-sharia as a way of framing and understanding other cultures, other laws. They named it the laws, nawamis. And by the way, also, this is connected to Greek. The nomi. Nomos is law, and the plural is nomoi, or something like that. A word that means cause of good, since namus in technical usage is the one through whom good comes. So these were the wise laws, nawamis al-hikmiyah, established by the rational thinkers, because they're not prophets. So all you have available to you is your intellect and your own spiritual struggles, as understood by your intellect. That's why they're called rational thinkers. As the result of an inspiration from God, of which they were unaware, for the sake of the wholesomeness, order, and arrangement of everyone in the world, where there is no divinely revealed religion, right? So he calls them the uqala. And this is very fascinating. But to just very briefly talk about this word, Ibn Arabi does not make it up. He inherits its intellectual genealogy from the 9th to 10th century translation movements, right? And he uses this word really frequently. So that's why you have to know its context. So in this chapter, I go through the intellectual development of this word, which then reaches Ibn al-Arabi, and he uses it with that intellectual genealogy in mind. So it's not just with reference to Allah. It also means political philosophy. And that's how he understands it too, right? So these are the non-prophetic laws and philosophical systems and political philosophy, in other words, Farabian, and governmental legislation, right? That's established by what? By the maqasid al-sharia, which protect people's lives, their families, their relations, and their wealth. Actually, there should be wealth in there somewhere. Yeah, so possessions, wealth, lives, families, and their kinship relations. So, in terms of the intellectual context, the development of the word namus comes from Al-Farabi and this Arabic translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in which you find numerous references to the nawamis, in addition to other writings, but we won't go into them, right? So Al-Arabi has like these lengthy passages. I'm just going to quote one sentence, not the lengthy passages, where he talks about these non-prophetic laws. And he says, God the Exalt casts it, yulqihi, this wisdom from his name, the inward, the wise, into the hearts of the sages of the era. So where do they get this knowledge from? The al-batin al-hakim, the inward, the wise, right? Since everything is related to God's wujud. From whence they do not perceive it. That's quoting the Quran. So they legislated for their followers amongst the people of their era. So if they establish the legal limits, the hudud of that namus, i.e. the penal code, restricting themselves to it and observing it, God recompenses them in accordance with that for how they acted in this world and the next. They are recompensed in accordance with the established law, indicated by the words, and what they observed of it rightfully concerning that which they invented of rahbaniyah. Rahbaniyah is a word that means monasticism, but in Ibn al-Arabi's vocabulary, if you say monasticism, they invented it. وَرَهْبَانِيَةٍ ابْتَدَعُوهَا, he means sagehood. He means sagehood. And so it's supported by that verse, according to Ibn al-Arabi, and it's supported by prophetic hadith. Whoever establishes a good and beautiful custom, sunnah hasana, he shall have its reward and the reward of whoever does it. And whoever establishes a bad sunnah shall bear its sin, and the sinner who does it as well. So whoever establishes these good laws, which are beautiful, will have the reward. Therefore, God confirms the doctrine of the one who establishes the law derived from wisdom, just as he confirms the one who brings the revealed law that establishes judgment, which means the prophetic laws, because they're the ones that bring the ahkam, the divine ahkam. So there's a long conclusion, but it's summarized by Ibn Arabi's understanding of Rahmah, in which God says, we never chastise a people until we send forth a messenger. So Ibn Arabi says, hence, this verse has within it a tremendous mercy because of the diversity of human dispositions that lead to a diversity of views. He who knows the all-inclusiveness of the divine mercy, which God reports embraces all things, knows that God did this only because of mercy towards his servants. And that's that.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Thank you very much indeed. And this is the book you've been discussing, Ibn Arabi's Religious Pluralism,
Yes.
Levels of Inclusivity, published 2025 by Routledge in the Routledge Studies in Islamic Philosophy. It's part of a series, and there's some very high praise indeed from eminent scholars for your work. So congratulations on that. I have read parts of it. It is very academic. I mean, that's a good thing, but it's not my area. So I was occasionally not really conversant with the discussions. There's awful lot there that is also for a more general reader as well, I think, about his life, his general teachings,
Yes.
Ibn Arabi's views and so on. So it's something for everyone, I think. I do recommend it. So thank you very much indeed, Dr. Faris, for your incredible energy in going through all of this in just a couple of hours. Extraordinary. And I think we'll leave it there. I did actually have questions, but you actually covered them more or less in your presentation. So that was a relief for me. So thank you very much indeed for that. And we'll put a link to the book in the description below, and any other links that Dr. Faris thinks is appropriate, we'll add those in due course. So thank you very much, sir, and take care, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.